All right, thanks for joining us. We are back looking at, is Jesus presented as God in the New Testament, specifically in the Gospel of Mark? This is part 2. Last week we looked at Mark chapter 1 and specifically verses 2 to 3. Notice this question continues to be posed in a variety of ways, as if it's just being read into a few of Jesus's quotes. But I think the gospel writers present a much larger, compelling picture when we understand the references and allusions they are using from the Old Testament. Mark specifically is presenting Jesus as God to us. And we looked at last week, you can go back to part 1 to see a more thorough explanation, but we looked at verses 2 to 3, where Mark begins his gospel with a combined quote from Malachi 3 and Isaiah 40. And both of those quotes are a foretelling of the arrival of a messenger who will prepare the way of the Lord. And after this messenger has come, Yahweh in both Isaiah 40 and Malachi 3 promises to come next. So Malachi 3, the messenger is going to go forth, and then Yahweh is going to arrive and judge his temple. And we see Jesus doing that in Mark 11 to 13. Then verse 3, Isaiah promises the messenger is going to come first and declare Yahweh's salvation, and then Yahweh will come. And so you have this combined quote of Malachi and Isaiah, both foretelling a messenger will come, and then Yahweh will come. Well, what happens next in Mark's Gospel? Verse 4, John immediately comes, who we know to be the messenger. That's rarely contested. He's the messenger of Malachi, the messenger of Isaiah, the one that was foretold. And then, of course, that anticipates Yahweh as the next figure to come on the scene. Well, who arrives in Mark's Gospel? Verse 9, in those days Jesus came. So again, I think in a small way, probably not a small way, it's a pretty massive introduction. Mark has already introduced Jesus as coming as Yahweh after his messenger, who he foretold through Malachi and through Isaiah. So today we're going to look at Mark 1, verses 16 to 17. And this is the passage where Jesus famously calls his disciples as fishers of men. I'm going to argue that this is not Jesus' discipleship strategy for the church. I understand 21st century churches use this all the time as a description of Jesus' discipleship strategy, but I think it's much more than that. I think it's his connection and identifying himself with a theme associated with Yahweh from the Old Testament. I'll give you some examples on the right. We have Ezekiel 12, Amos 4, and Habakkuk 1. We'll look at Jeremiah 16 last, but before we do that, I want you to notice the way Yahweh describes himself and his judgments in these various Old Testament passages. In Ezekiel 12, Ezekiel is prophesying against Judah, specifically their rebellious king Zedekiah. And listen to how Yahweh describes himself. He says, I will spread my net over him. This is an allusion to, or an image of a fisherman out at sea. And he's got this big net, and he's going to throw his net into the sea, and he's going to drag out all of these fish out of their home. And Yahweh is saying, in the same way a fisherman throws his net into the sea and drags up these fish, I am going to judge King Zedekiah, dragging him up out of Judah and taking him, carrying him off to Babylon. So this is the first image of Yahweh as a fisherman, or using fishermen. He's specifically going to use Babylon to do this. And you see this image also mentioned in Amos chapter 4. Amos is prophesying to Israel, speaking of the northern kingdom, I should say. And again, it's Yahweh who is talking, verse 3, and he declares that he's going to remove Israel's oppressors. These are people in power in Israel, buying up large portions of land. These are the priests who are perverting God's law. There are oppressors in Israel, and Yahweh's going to remove their oppressors. Well, how's he going to do that? Well, it speaks of Assyria, but listen to how the Lord describes it. It says, the Lord God, this is Adonai, again, verse 3 shows that it's Yahweh speaking. The Lord God has shown by his holiness that, behold, the days are coming upon you when they shall take you away with hooks, even the last of you with fish hooks. So this is this image again. The way that Yahweh is going to accomplish judgment on Israel's oppressors is he's going to summon people who are going to act as fishermen. As fishermen grab fish out of the sea with hooks, so Yahweh is going to send Assyria to carry off Israel's oppressors, even the last of you, with fish hooks. Again, Yahweh, as he used a net in Ezekiel, is going to use fish hooks in Amos. It's also mentioned again in the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk is a prophet in Judah, and he's trying to figure out why the wicked are flourishing. Lord, your word is being perverted. The law is going forth pervertedly. People aren't upholding your commands. What are you going to do about the wicked? Well, in verse 5, God promises to send the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. And notice how the Babylonians are described. Yahweh's going to use the Babylonians to do what in verse 15? He will bring Judah up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet. Again, this is Yahweh summoning fishermen to judge Judah, to judge Israel, to judge the wicked among them. So this theme of judgment upon Yahweh's enemies or the idolatries of Israel is always met with Yahweh presenting himself as some sort of fishing imagery, summing up fishermen, using fish hooks, nets to deal out his judgment. And so we arrive here in Mark chapter 1, verses 16 to 17. And Israel is plagued with a den of robbers in Mark. That's how the leaders of the temple are described. We see by Mark 3, those who are leading Israel have set their hearts to partner, I think it's Mark 3 verse 5, to partner with the Herodians to kill Jesus, who's an innocent man presented in the Gospels. So that should strike us. Wow, the leaders of Israel, the protectors of God's law, should be upholding it. Instead, they want to murder someone. And all throughout the book, we see Israel's plagued by demons and illnesses and death and all these marks of the curse. So Mark's gospel opens with Israel under all these curses, under all this oppression. And Jesus arrives, again, I would argue presented as Yahweh by the quote of Malachi and Isaiah at the beginning. Jesus passes along the Sea of Galilee in verses 16 to 17. And then verse 17, Jesus says to these men, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." Well, what's he talking about? Is it simply because in verse 16 they happen to be a hobby, their labor was fishermen? I mean, I think that's somewhat relevant, but I think there's much more to it. And this is where Jeremiah 16 is so important. In Jeremiah 16, verses 14 to 15, I'll read it. It says, "Therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when it shall no longer be said," and this is a reference to the first Exodus, "As the Lord lives who brought up the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt." People are going to stop saying that, according to verse 14. There's something so amazing that's going to happen, that the first Exodus is going to fall away from the consciousness of Israelites. Verse 15, "As the Lord lives who brought up the people of Israel out of the north country, and out of all the countries where he had driven them." And what's happening there, it says, "For I will bring them back to their own land that I gave to their fathers." This is what we call the second Exodus. Yahweh is telling Israel that the first Exodus, great as it was, is nothing compared to the second Exodus that's coming. Jeremiah 16 verse 14, you're going to forget about the Exodus out of Egypt because of the second Exodus that's going to come. And this second Exodus theme is central to Isaiah's gospel. They call it the first gospel, but to the book of Isaiah, specifically chapters 40 to 66. This idea of a second Exodus is very prevalent, which is important for Mark because Mark is going to present through the book of Isaiah, several quotes in his gospel, that Jesus is leading a second Exodus. And Jeremiah mentions this second Exodus here. They're going to stop talking about the first Exodus because of this second Exodus. Well, how will the second Exodus begin? Verse 16. "Behold," you'll see it right here, down at the bottom right, "I am sending for many fishers," or fishermen, declares the Lord, "and they shall catch them. And afterward I will send for many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain and every hill and out of the cleft of the rocks." So the second Exodus is going to begin with the summoning or gathering up of fishermen to do the Lord's work, to do Yahweh's work. And notice that work is not only going to be an act of saving, it's going to be an act of judgment, like the other references to fishermen in the Old Testament. Verse 17, "For my eyes are on all their ways. They are not hidden from me, nor is their iniquity concealed from my eyes. But first I will doubly repay their iniquity and their sin, because they have polluted my land with carcasses of their detestable idols, and have filled my inheritance with their abominations." So Jeremiah is saying, a second Exodus is coming, and it's going to be so great you're going to stop talking about the first Exodus. And the way Yahweh is going to begin that second Exodus is he's going to summon fishermen to himself to help him, one, save his people, gather up his people, two, to judge their idolatries and their oppressors. Now, the reason this is important is because Mark chapter 1 opens with Yahweh promising that his messenger is going to go forth, then he's going to come, he's going to judge the temple, and he's going to save his people. John the messenger comes, and then instead of Yahweh, Jesus arrives because he's being presented as Yahweh. And the next thing Jesus does is, before he begins his second Exodus, Mark 1 verse 17, he gathers fishermen to himself. And remember, Jeremiah 16 is going to, it includes this reference to fishermen as a way of judging Israel's oppressors. Well, what does Mark 1 show Jesus doing? Verse 21 to 28, he performs an exorcism. Verses 29 to 33, he begins mass public healings. Verses 35 to 39, he's proclaiming the gospel. Verses 40 to 45, he's healing leprosy. So Mark opens the gate with this reference to Yahweh coming, both to save but also to triumph over Israel's enemies. And what do we see Jesus doing? Well, he summons fishermen to himself, and then that's exactly what he does. He triumphs over demons. He triumphs over disease. He triumphs over death. Jesus is being presented to us as the saving Yahweh of the Old Testament, who has come to offer salvation to his people and to deliver all those who oppress them. He is being presented as God in flesh.